And we're back.
Hey!
Hello. As I'm getting comfy in this seat again, I guess. It's
You're
Thursday.
always jumping around, aren't you?
I don't sit still. ADHD. Too
Yep.
bad. Another Thursday. That means it's another night of Whispers Within with me and
On
Kim.
in bulk. You know what that means? Spring is coming.
Yes. Hey, it's been feeling like spring here in Minnesota for the last several weeks. We haven't had a snowstorm yet.
Don't even get me started. We had 29 inches in 3 or 4 days, and now
where I am, we've just had a dusting, and that's it.
No.
Like today, it almost reached 60 degrees, so I will take
We
that.
were almost there today. We were like in the 50s, so I'm happy. It's perfectly fitting for all the metaphysical in us out there. Happy in bulk. Spring is coming. Yay.
Spring. No more winter, hopefully. But tonight we were going to dive deep into Chicago hauntings, Chicago haunted locations, everything Chicago with our amazing guest. You also are. I'm going to butcher her last name. I'm so sorry. The Bielski. But I met
her out.
Yeah, let's just bring her up. Hello.
That was perfect.
I was perfect.
Nobody pronounces my name right. You were perfect.
I met this amazing lady. I don't even know. I want to say 2017, but I have a feeling we met way before that.
It was way before that.
I think we met through Willie Atkins and some type of Paracon or something.
Yeah.
And we just hit it off, and we reconnected last spring at Broadhead Manor for Spirits in the Spring. And you finally started to come back on Facebook. I'm like, okay, got to get her booked on the show now.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I was on Facebook for 4 years. Everyone thought I died. So I was like, it's exciting to be back on all these shows.
I saw you come back on. I'm like, yay, she's coming back on. And then she started you're doing events again. I'm like, yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're working on the next Chicago Ghost Con, hopefully for October. So because I talked to you, we're going to really, really push to make it happen.
Yes, because I don't count the last one I went to as a good one, but that was my reasoning. I don't remember much of it because of everything that was happening.
But it's weird though. There's all it seems like there were so many, and I know it was personal, a time of personal trauma for you, Jenny, when you came. And that has been the case for so many people that have come to Chicago Ghost Con. And everybody said that it's so different from all the other Paracons because it's such a personal place.
Yeah.
And so, it doesn't really surprise me to hear that about you, where you came, you were going through stuff and you met people that helped you get through it, and you've been friends with ever since.
Yeah. Well, I remember that night, that whole weekend really was trying to make me laugh. Christopher Booth, Rachel Booth at the time, Scott Greenwald, Jeff Rasman with his wife. And I was like, oh, I'm just here trying to escape Minnesota for a bit.
Yeah.
Trying to keep my...
Such nice people. Everyone you mentioned, just the salt of the earth, the nicest people in the whole world. Yeah. And we lost Scott Grunwald last year. It's just such a big black hole in our whole community.
It kind of hit me hard. We were at Haunted Rock Island Paracon last October, and there was a medium walking around kind of doing readings, and Scott came through to speak to me, and he says you have to rebrand your photography because you're so into that historical, capturing historical haunted locations and the spirits. You just can't do what I had it. You had to rebrand. And that day I came up with the new name of Stories Within Were Always There as the caption. So he came through and gave me good message.
I'd love to talk to you more about that off the later. Yeah,
definitely. So tell us a little about yourself for people who don't know who you are.
Oh yeah. So I'm a Chicago native. I have been a paranormal investigator. I was thinking about this the other day. Since 1988, that was when I did my first paranormal investigation, and that was way long before anybody was interested in any of this. And
that was when it was like taboo, like you don't speak of it.
Yeah. No, it's funny that you say that, Jenny, because when I was in high school, I went to Catholic school. I'm still Catholic, but even Catholics back then were like didn't really believe in the supernatural being part of our world. That's totally changed now. And, we have exorcists all over YouTube, and, the Catholic Church totally, like everyone from the Catholic Church is talking about the reality of the supernatural. But when I was in high school, I was very interested in cemeteries and ghosts. And I did a history project on our local cemetery and took all these beautiful photos of our local historic cemetery and talked about the history there. And the principal called my mom to come in and have a conference with my teachers because they said I had these morbid interests and there must be something wrong with me. So things have changed a lot from back then. But that's how I started. I started from the time I was very young. I grew up in a house where we had things going on. The house that I grew up in was very near to where I live now. I live about 2 miles west of Wrigley Field here in Chicago.
Okay.
The house in an apartment, and I'll get to that in a second. The house that I grew up in was built by my great uncle, who was an architect around 1900. And when we moved into the house, it was like literally falling apart. My mom knew that the house had been built by her uncle, and she was determined to move into the house and rehab it because it was falling apart. So my mom and dad bought it in 1967. And their very first night that they were in the house, my dad was a cop at the time, and he heard someone running around upstairs. My mom and dad were sleeping in the dining room downstairs because the upstairs was just a wreck. So my dad took his service revolver from the nightstand and went up all through the house looking for the intruder, and there was no one there. And he came back into the dining room where my mom was sleeping and said, "It's spooks, just go back to bed." And that was the first night in that house. And every night that we were in that house, we had experiences. And it was always something like that, like footsteps running or coming up the stairs. And there were so many things that happened over those years, but that was how I got interested in it. And when I started to go to the library and things like that, I started to get all the books that I could about the paranormal. And I started to get at a very young age books, not just like ghost story books, but books about parapsychology.
Yeah.
And that's how I first got interested in it. And when I got to college, I went to college out in the western suburbs of Chicago at Benedictine University. I was very lucky to meet a young man that was studying psychology, and he was actually focusing his studies on parapsychology.
Oh, wow.
And so he took me under his wing and taught me about how to test people for psychic abilities and let me help with field investigations and ghost and haunting. So this was 1988, and this is how I came to my first investigation. And that's how it all started happening. And my thing now, as you know, is I have done investigations all these years, 35 years going into houses. Mostly it's mostly just helping people that are really having issues with something that's going on that they can't understand. But through all that, the way that I've really kind of like come into the public eye is through the ghost lore. So I've documented the ghost stories in Chicago. And so I've written 12 books about Chicago's haunted history.
Yeah.
And during that time, started Chicago Hauntings Tours, which my husband and I ran for 20 years until 2020. So that's a little bit about me, probably more than you wanted me to say right then, but a little bit about me.
Oh, I love it though.
There's
so you've been into it even when it was taboo.
Awesome visuals. Who does all these great visuals?
I Google search and I put them all in Google Slides and
amazing, just amazing. Like, thank you, Jenny.
I remember at Spirits in the Spring because it was I think like 2 weeks before I would go to Juliet prison, and I got the book from you, and you go, you have to keep your, because I'm like, I'm a psychic medium empath, and you're like, you really have to keep your guard up at Juliet. Like, this book will help you understand what you might encounter at Juliet. So I read that book in like 2 days, and that's not a thin book. That's a thick book.
It's a thick book. Yeah. You know,
it's so good.
Thank you. Joliet Prison. The first time I was there was when I was a very young girl. I think I was like 6 years old. My dad was he was a vet from World War II. He was a cop, and he took me down there when I was like 6 years old to literally pick somebody up that got out of prison.
Oh, wow.
Like a friend of his, right? And that was the first time that I was there. And the second time that I was there was in 2018. It was right after my mom passed away, and I was completely devastated. My mom had been sick for like a year. She was my life forever, but that last year, I mean, it was everything. So she had just passed away, and someone sent me a link saying that Joliet Prison had opened up for tours earlier that year, and now they wanted to do ghost tours.
Yeah.
And they were looking for applications from people that could make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a total wreck, but I was like, there's nobody that can do this except our company. Right. Yeah. And so I put all the thing together. It was crazy because we had to not only research and design the tours, put the whole tour route together.
Oh, wow.
So we had to actually staff the tours every night for like 8 weeks.
Wow.
With really great tour guides that could tell the history and also provide, ghost hunting equipment and teach people how to do ghost hunting and everything else. But it was perfect because we knew all these people, right? Like there were so many people that already knew so much of the history of the prison and were so excited. They loved the prison already and they wanted to do it. So we put it all together. We set up the tours and we did them, and it was nuts because that prison was closed in 2002.
Yeah.
And it was, by the time we got there, you were there. It was desolate.
Oh, yeah.
In that amount of time, those not even 20 years. I mean, it was, most of the buildings were off limits to the public because they were so dangerous. Ceilings falling in, floors falling in. And we had the gymnasium, the solitary confinement, couple other, the hospital, the prison yard, very few places that were allowed for us to come in. And, two things were happening. We started doing the tours and I started doing this deep dive into the history of the place, and soon discovered that the history of that place
is so deep.
It's so deep. Exactly. Like, you think, okay, yeah. So every single prisoner in Illinois history that was condemned to a long sentence was processed there.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
A lot of them went to other prisons late. I mean, that was the only prison for a long time. It was opened in 1850. 58.
Yeah.
And then Stateville Prison, which is right nearby, was opened in the 1920s. And the goal was for the old prison to be closed, but it wasn't. So they continued in tandem, and every single prisoner. So when you think about Illinois crime, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think about all the gangsters.
Yeah.
You think about Richard Speck, John Wayne Gacy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all these people.
They all were there.
They were all there. And then the worst part about it, I discovered, was not that these people who had done these heinous crimes came in there, but the things that were done inside the prison.
Yeah.
After they were incarcerated, hundreds of stabbings, shootings, stranglings, prisoner on prisoner, prisoner on guard, prisoner on wardens,
and
suicides.
Oh yeah. And the guards at Juliet didn't have guns inside. The only people that had guns were the guards up on the towers.
Exactly.
But if you walk through the gates, the guards did not have any weapons, nothing to protect them. So they were walking in empty-handed. And the only people that had weapons, I found out on the tour with Dave Schrader and the people at the time who were doing the paranormal tours in May before they shut it all down, didn't have weapons. The only people were up in the guards up in the towers. And I looked at those towers. Those are hard to get up and down. So if you needed something, you're kind of screwed out of luck.
Right. Every single night that our tours went through there, it was insane. The number one thing that happened to our tour groups was that as they walked through the prison yard, we would have rocks and stones thrown at us.
Oh, wow.
Almost every single night. There are also 2 payphones that were out in the prison yard.
They still have them.
And these were places, and it was crazy because we had so many former prison guards that came on the tours and former inmates that came on the tours. And they all told us that those payphones were places where so much trauma happened, where, people would call from home and give the news that someone had died, or someone else was in prison, or girlfriends would call and say, I'm breaking up with you, or wives would call and say, I'm leaving you. So these were places of such high emotions. So it's not surprising that there would be these imprints, left behind in the landscape, these true hauntings that were left here. It's just really crazy. For me, one of the most interesting things about Joliet Prison was the old prison cemetery that's up on the hill that overlooks the prison. And this, from looking through all old newspaper articles and archives, there are more than 800 bodies still buried up on the bluff that overlooks the prison. And they're all unmarked graves. And it's really tragic because in the past few years, the city of Joliet has unveiled these plans to develop that area as like a nature preserve.
Yeah.
And there's no mention of the cemetery.
Graves. Yeah.
Yikes.
That place is creepy. Like, we went in May for 2 nights with Dave Schrader, and this was right before they shut down anything and everything paranormal. So we were basically like the last big event to happen there. And the hospital was a hot place for us, which I found weird because they had Richard Speck work in the hospital while he was a prisoner there. Like, looking back at what he did to get into prison and having him work at the hospital, I was like, why would you do that? Like, that doesn't make sense.
I've never heard that, but that's interesting.
Yeah, that's what one tour guide said, that Richard Speck would help the nurses at the hospital, at the prison. I'm like, okay, that's kind of weird. And we had him come through a couple of the ghost box sessions in the hospital, which was really kind of cool, but kind of creepy at the same time.
One of the big ghost stories there, or big tragedies there, was the story of Odette Allen, who was the warden's wife. She was a wonderful singer from New Orleans that the warden met when he was on I think he was on actually went to a prison conference, like a warden's conference down in New Orleans, and he met this beautiful, talented young woman. And it's so fascinating to me that the warden and the families lived at the prison. Yep. So when you walk into Joliet prison, you actually walk through the area where the warden and his family lived.
Well, not anymore, because the roof collapsed, so they have you go through the main gate.
Oh now. Yeah, totally off limits. Yeah, but Odette Allen, she was so close to the inmates, as was her husband, and they called them their boys, and it was a mutual admiration society.
She would sing for them at night, she would go to solitary, that main North Seg, and sing for them.
Right.
You go into North Seg, you can smell her perfume. If you smell perfume, that's her. They say that's her going in and singing. If you sing in North Seg, that's when the activity just gets crazy, because that's what the spirits know of, is her coming in and singing to kind of get them to be kind of very happy, kind of, what do you want to call that?
Right. Yeah, she was one weekend, she was supposed to go to Chicago with her husband, Edmund Allen, a warden, for a warden's conference. And she had ordered a new dress to go to the ball in Chicago, and it wasn't finished. So she decided she didn't want to go because her dress wasn't ready. And so her husband went to Chicago and she stayed home. She took their kids to the movies, came back, went to bed. The next morning, she, as usual, her servant, who was one of the prisoners, if they were good, they could work in the warden's house. And so they called him Chicken Joe.
Yes.
He was her, her maid's, her ladies' maid, right? Yeah. He would do everything for her. I'm talking Downton Abbey people. The ladies.
Yeah, that's what I picture when they told me that.
Yeah,
so Downtown
he Abbey, would do. He would help her dress. He would wash her hair. He would bring her breakfast. He would dress her. And this morning, he brought her the paper and her coffee, and she said, "Come back in a little while because I want you to help me wash my hair." And he said, "Okay." So he left, and then someone smelled smoke coming from her room, and the door was locked, and they found that she had been burned in her bed. Oh. And, to this day, people talk about encountering her spirit there, and not only in the prison, but up in the prison cemetery. Oh, wow. Where in 1933, one of the craziest things in ghost lore in United States history happened, where the singing ghost of Joliet prison spread all over the news across the United States, because people were hearing this ghostly voiced singing from the prison cemetery up on the bluff overlooking the prison. And there were literally tens of thousands of people that came out and camped out in the prison cemetery. And this is all again, this is all abandoned area now, but all the bodies are still there. Mm-hmm. And people still say that they will hear this singing and see apparitions moving there. And some people have wondered if it was Odette Allen, because she was such a great singer.
Road trip time.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I would say, if anyone is in Joliet, near Joliet, you can still do day tours, but they will not talk about anything paranormal, I guess.
Really? So. I didn't know that.
Yeah. After the event in May with Dave Schrader, there was a new head person of Juliet prison or whatever that came in and shut everything down to paranormal. So they will not talk about paranormal anymore.
Well, I have to tell you, I had a terrible experience with the prison because after everything that we did, and I mean, we had like 12 people that just gave their lives to doing the tours. We raised so much money for the restoration of the prison by doing the tours. And then they just stopped talking to us.
Oh, wow.
And I've seen that happen like several times, like where it's just crazy. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
I think it's because the place is it's one of like the 3 places that I've encountered that is just so toxic. Yeah. And I think it's all that dark, all those dark entities history that are there. Yeah. I think it causes all kinds of relationship issues, upheaval, all kinds of chaos. And I've seen that there over. It's so interesting, Jenny, that you said that, because that's been one of my places where I'm like, yep, that place is bad because it's nothing but chaos. I've lost so many friends over it. And
I guess it's like a big lawsuit, like, because I don't know if it's like the city of Juliet that owns it or if it's like a private, like, nonprofit that owns it.
It's the state of Illinois that owns it. And as far as I know, when we went in 2018, the state of Illinois owned it and they leased it to the city of Juliet for like a year at a time.
It's like the state versus the city of Juliet. Right now, there's like a big lawsuit or something to try to bring like the person that's like the head of Juliet prison.
What happened?
I don't know. I'll pull up the article and find it because it's been a very hot topic.
That's crazy.
There's like a couple lawsuits. Like there's people that go to like the city meetings and try to take this person that is like in control of Juliet prison down because of what he has been doing to his volunteers, what he's been doing to the prison itself.
I know exactly who you're talking about, and that's the same guy that just gave me hell. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll pull up the articles and send them to you, but yeah.
Wow, okay.
So, I know another big thing in Chicago is, why can I not add it here? Resurrection Mary.
Oh my gosh, I have been writing about this gal all week long because I'm just about to release a hard copy book and an ebook that's just, yes, you cannot follow. Thank you, Jenny. This is all of the, this is so dear to my heart. These are all of the stories that I first collected 30 years ago for my first book, Chicago Haunts, but updated with everything that I've found since then. And Archer Avenue, Resurrection Mary is part of this, I don't know what to even call it, this enigma that is what myself and Michael Kleen also, who is another Illinois ghostlorist, we both independently call this area the Archer Avenue Triangle. And it's this area that's southwest of the city. Archer Avenue starts in Lake Michigan, right where like Chinatown is, on the near south side of Chicago. And it runs southwest out of the city all the way down to Joliet. In fact, Joliet Prison is part of haunted Archer Avenue because it's right on Archer Avenue, even though it's called Collins Street down there. But oh my gosh, Archer Avenue is one of the most haunted roads in the world, and it hosts so many different phenomena, from the ghost light of Maple Lake to many gangster ghosts that have been connected there, because it's said that Al Capone operated roadhouses down in that area. Willow Springs, that it runs through, is one of the most it's like as corrupt as Chicago, if you can believe it. Yeah. The Grimes sisters, the 2 sisters that disappeared in 1956 and were found in along the side of the road down there, they are said to still haunt that area. Oh my gosh, murder victims, phantom just ghost lights, phantom monks, phantom cars, phantom everything.
wow.
And Resurrection Mary, of course, Chicago's most famous ghost.
Before we get too far on another topic, I thought you might like to see this. Jennifer, who also was asking if you're going to be doing your tours again anytime soon, wanted to point out you're the reason she got into the paranormal. Isn't that awesome?
That makes my heart so happy.
And we had the gals over at Haunted Happy Hour.
Happy hour. Yep.
Lily and Vanessa.
So awesome.
Your books are the first books.
Oh, it's so crazy. You know, I'm so old now. I always have people come up to me, these wonderful, like, women come up to me, men too come up to me, and they're like, I became a teacher because of your books, or I became a historian because of your books. I'm like, what? It's so gratifying. It's wonderful. It's just wonderful. But you know, Archer Avenue, Resurrection Mary, that's the heart of everything in Chicago. That's the heart of all of our ghost lore. And it's where
you got me wanting to get in the car and like, head your way. 3 hours and I'm there.
It's like 6.5, 7 hours for me, but totally worth it, you know.
So other than the prison and that road, what other, if I came to Chicago right now, not counting the prison, because everybody does seem to know the prison, and you just talked about what top 3 other locations would you say, this is where I have to take you?
Yeah, it's so funny that you put that out there. Lincoln Park Zoo, and just all of Lincoln Park. It's so funny because Lincoln Park was never, oh gosh, you know, there's so many of these places, but you know, we were like the first people to go out there and investigate, and then now it's like this, like Lincoln Park is known as one of the most haunted places in Chicago now. But like no one ever talked about it until just a few years ago. We were, I was contacted by the events director at Lincoln Park Zoo, who asked if I could put a ghost tour together for the zoo. And Lincoln Park, which is for people who have been to Chicago and who have not been to Chicago, it is it's both a park and it's a neighborhood. And the park is right on Lake Michigan, and it's a beautiful park that was established you know, in the late 19th century. It houses Lincoln Park Zoo, the beautiful conservatory with beautiful plants. The Chicago History Museum is there, and it's right on the shore of Lake Michigan.
Oh yeah.
So it's just absolutely beautiful, like a, you know, 19th century Parisian park is what it's like. And the neighborhood behind it is so historic. It was in the 1920s. It was the hub of the North Side Irish mob that was led by Bugs Moran, who was the nemesis of Al Capone. So you have this beautiful 19th century palatial park, and you have this down and dirty history with the gangland era, but all of it is built on the city's original cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so from research that has been done by one woman, Pamela Banos, at Northwestern University in the last, like, probably 25 years, she has discovered that there are somewhere between 10 and 13,000 bodies still buried in Lincoln Park.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, underneath all of this, underneath the zoo, the history museum, and all of this other stuff, right on the lakeshore. The most sort of, you know, poignant part of the whole history of Lincoln Park is that after the city cemetery was founded in the mid-19th century, there was a cholera scare that broke out in Chicago, and people were really worried that the victims of cholera that were being buried in the cemetery were spreading the disease to the population, because it was right on the cemetery is right on Lake Michigan. So they thought that the water would be taking in all of those contaminants from the bodies. So the city council shut the cemetery down after only 10 years that it had been open. And they ordered everyone who had loved ones buried there to move the bodies to other cemeteries that were being buried far outside of the city at that time. But this was a long process, right? And a lot of people couldn't afford to move their loved ones. A lot of people didn't care. A lot of people didn't even know they had loved ones there. And then on the night of October 8th, 1871, the Chicago fire breaks out. And no one thought that the fire would reach the north side of the city where the cemetery was. But because of high winds that night, flaming debris was blown across the Chicago River.
Oh, wow.
And the fire just spread so fast north. And people living north of the river they were so shocked. They thought they were safe. They grabbed whatever they could and they just fled north to the cemetery. And when they got there, they found literally all of these open graves where people had taken their loved ones to move them, and they sought shelter in the open graves. But even then, they weren't safe, and they ended up having to go into Lake Michigan to get away from the fire.
Oh, wow.
But after that fire, all of the gravestones at that time, they weren't stones at all. They were what they called headboards. They were made of wood. Yep. So they were all destroyed in the fire. So if you hadn't already moved your bodies by that time, there was no way to find the graves anymore. So the city decided to just make a park of it. And that's why we have these 10 to 13,000 unmarked graves still there.
Yeah, definitely. I know another really good location that brings a lot of Chicago history is H.H. Holmes' murder castle.
Yep.
I know but a year ago, November, I was in town for Willie's event that got canceled. So on the way to the airport, he drove me past the H.H. Holmes murder castle where it was. That is a creepy area.
It is. It's interesting that you say that. The murder castle of H.H. Holmes, who's known as like America's first serial killer, who was preying on victims at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, that stood right here where there's now this post office on the left that was built in the 1920s. The murder castle mysteriously burnt down after H.H. Holmes was arrested. And we don't know how many people he killed. I think he claimed that he killed like 8 people. And some historians believe he killed as many as 300 people.
Yeah, 300.
I became very close to the story a few years earlier than you came to the Chicago Ghost Con, because we had Jeff Mudgett at one of our Ghost Cons.
He was at 2017. I met him at yours.
Oh, did you? Okay. Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And yeah, that's right. He was at that. He is the great, 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 great grandson of Herman Webster Mudgett, known as H.H. Holmes. And Jeff found out about his heritage like around the Thanksgiving dinner table when he was, I think, 40 years old. And one of his cousins or nephews had gone to college and was taking a genealogy class. And the family always said that they had lineage going back to Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I found out we're not related to Robert E. Lee, but we do have another very famous person in our ancestry, and it's H.H. Holmes, the serial killer. And I guess the grandfather, as Jeff said, stood up at the dining table so forcefully that his chair
flung back,
crashed against the wall. Mm-hmm. And he said, that name will never be mentioned in this house again. So this is how Jeff found out about who he was. And since then, he's been trying to use that for good to try and identify as many of the victims as possible, because there are all of these people who had ancestors, women who came to Chicago during the World's Fair 1893 and disappeared. So he's trying to help those families discover whether their ancestors were victims of his, and it's quite an amazing story. But that place is a place where so many people have had experiences. The postal workers that work in that building. I actually did a TV show for PBS here in Chicago, The Hauntings of Chicago, where we went there. And Jeff was actually part of that show. And the postal workers talked about how, actually, Jeff said when he went there, they told him, don't go down in the basement. It's a terrible haunted place.
Oh, wow.
And he went down, and Jeff had a history of seizures. And he hadn't had one in something like 20 years. And when he went down into that basement, he had a seizure. There were reports from the postal workers there. There was one that we documented in the show that we did, where one of the postal workers had gone down at the basement, and she was getting some boxes. And she went around a corner after she came down the hall, and she heard some scruffling about, and she called out to her colleague, Phyllis, is that you? And there was no answer. And this was like 35 seconds that she came down this hall, went around the corner, heard the noise, and then went back around the corner. When she went back around the corner, in the hallway, there had been a row of, just like modern chairs, like Formica chairs lined up, maybe like 10 chairs. She had come down the hallway. They were all lined up in a neat row. 35 seconds later, she came around and they were all stacked up. It was like Poltergeist, the movie Poltergeist. And it's fascinating. But also with H.H. Holmes, the Museum of Science and Industry in Jackson Park. Jackson Park is where the World's Fair was in 1893. The only building that was built, most of the buildings that were built for the World's Fair were made of something called staff, which was like a plaster, and it was like a paper mache, but they had like broken stone like mixed in. So it was harder than like plaster, right? So most of the buildings were made of this because they weren't meant to last. But there was one building that was meant to last, and that was the Palace of Fine Arts, because that was where there were hundreds of masterpieces of art that were brought from all over the world to be housed there for the World's Fair, so that people could come and see these masterpieces from Europe, that they would most people couldn't normally go over to see. So it had to be, waterproof and everything else. So that was the only building that was left at the fairgrounds after the fair, and that became the Museum of Science and Industry. That is one of the most popular museums in Chicago today, right?
Yep, been there.
Yeah. And man, that place, people are like, what's the most haunted buildings in Chicago? That is way at the top of the list. Not only was that part of the World's Fair, I'm going to come back to the World's Fair in a second, but it also houses the U-505 submarine that was captured in World War II. That is absolutely haunted by the captain, Peter Zesch, that attempted to commit suicide. He didn't finish himself off, so his crew, because he was whining and crying, they muffled his voice so that the sonar of the Russians couldn't pick him up, and they ended up killing him.
Oh, wow.
He had his legs have been seen, just his legs outside of the captain's quarters, and voices of men speaking in German. So there's that. The museum also houses the Burlington Zephyr train. That was this beautiful sterling silver train that stainless steel train that would come through Chicago in the evening. My mom, who died a few years ago, she said when she was a little girl in the 1930s, they would go down to the train tracks in the evening to wait for the Zephyr to come through Chicago because it was like a silver bullet.
Oh wow.
They have one of the train cars in there, and they say that they hear music and talking on the train. Outside of the back portico of the museum, one of the most often cited ghosts in Chicago is the ghost of Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, who was one of the most famous defense attorneys in American history, who defended Leopold and Loeb, the thrill killers that killed little Bobby Franks back in the 1920s.
Wow.
Yeah, and so many people have seen his ghost out on the back stairs overlooking the Jackson Park Lagoon out there. But H.H. Holmes himself, this is a crazy story. I was invited to tell ghost stories at an event for kids at the museum. Oh gosh, probably 20 years ago now. And so I'm out there on the back stairs telling the story of Clarence Darrow and telling about Resurrection Mary and stuff. And then this security guard comes up to me and he puts this folded up piece of paper in my hand and he walks away. So I open it up and it says, "They told us not to talk to you, but you have to call me."
Oh, wow.
Oh my
So
god.
the next day, yeah. So the next day I call him and he tells me all the stuff about the museum. And all the stuff I already told you, and including these two. He said that there's an exhibit in the museum that's called Yesterday's Main Street. You probably remember it. It's like a turn of the century street scene. So it's got like 19th century storefronts and gas lights and cobblestone streets. And there's even like little Nickelodeon where you can watch silent movies. There's an ice cream parlor.
Remember that? Yep.
Yeah. The security guard told me during the night they see H.H. Holmes walking through the scene. And right, isn't that doesn't that just make total sense that this person would be drawn to this scene? But he also literally walked there, when he
For
was
real, yeah.
Wow, yeah.
So it's crazy. And the other one that it still breaks my heart. It was probably I think it was 2005. There was a tour group, high school tour group. Of course, tour groups, school groups come from all over the Midwest to Chicago for field trips, right?
Oh yeah.
So a tour group came from St. Louis, and it was the weekend before Mother's Day, and they were at the museum. And I'm sure you remember this because it's very distinctive. They have I think it's 4 stairwells, and they're open stairwells, like atrium stairwells, and they're named by the colors, like the red stairwell, the blue stairwell. And this class was coming down to go down to the basement to the cafeteria to have lunch. And one of the girls tried to straddle the railing and slide down.
Oh wow.
And she misjudged the distance and went over the railing. So she fell like 4 floors down to the basement, where there are, I think, marble floors on the basement, and died, of course, instantly. And the security guard told me that they still and this was this was probably 2010 that I was there. And he told me they still were seeing her just standing there smiling in the stairwell.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
What about this one? What about where John Dillinger was killed outside the Biograph Theater?
Oh my gosh. The Biograph Theater. This is one of those classic Chicago ghost stories. This was oh gosh, I have to mention the late great Richard Crowe, Chicago's original ghost hunter. He was, literally I think he must have been the original, like, popular ghost hunter in the United States. We had Hans Holzer and we had the
Yep.
Warrens in the 1970s. The Warrens came after him. Hans Holzer was before that, but I mean, Richard Crowe had to be right up there with Hans Holzer when he was investigating things, and he started the very first ghost tours, I think, in the world here in Chicago in 1972.
Oh wow.
And this is one of those stories, like a handful of stories that he had, established back then. John Dillinger, he was the first public enemy number one. He was an Indiana farm boy who became a bank robber, and he just robbed banks all over the place. He picked up his right-hand man, which was Babyface Nelson, and they had a shootout with the FBI up in Mercer, Wisconsin at the Little Bohemia Lodge. In 1934, and then they came back down here to Chicago. And I have a very personal connection to this because my uncle was a little boy at that time, and he was a newsboy, and he remembered being woken up by the paper, the paper, their paper guy in the middle of the night, because they had to go out in the middle of the night with the newspapers because John Dillinger had been shot.
Oh, wow.
Because the weeks before that, he had been seen all over the north side of Chicago, and everybody was like on the alert for John Dillinger. I mean, he had killed cops and, the whole gamut. So on that July night in 1934, he had gone to see a gangster movie, actually, at the Biograph Theater at Lincoln Avenue in Lincoln Park with his girlfriend, or it wasn't actually his girlfriend. It was actually a prostitute that he spent a lot of time with, and her chaperone. I guess prostitutes had chaperones in those days. So they went to see the movie at the Biograph. But little did John Dillinger know that the chaperone, Anna Sage, had gone into an agreement with the FBI in Chicago to help them catch Dillinger. And she agreed that she was going to wear a bright red dress, and so that they could identify when they came out of the theater, they would see where he was because he was with her. And when they came out of the theater, he didn't know this, but the whole block was covered with FBI and police, and they took just a few stops down that block, and then he knew something was up, and he ran down the little alleyway right north of Fullerton Avenue, and he was just showered with gunfire from police and FBI, and he died there. That alley, it's interesting because that alley has not been known to be haunted since 1934. It's only been known to be haunted since the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But with research and just people that have contacted me, I've discovered that there were 4 other deaths that happened in that alleyway since 1970, including 2 suicides. So I think it's highly unlikely that if there's a haunting in the alleyway that there seems to be, that it's John Dillinger. I don't think it is, even though we'd like it to be, right? Because it lines up with the story, but it doesn't always line up so perfectly. So,
yeah. Haunted Happy Hour asks, do you think the site of St. Valentine's Day Massacre is haunted? People say that at night you can still hear the gunshots. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is one of the first places my dad took me to when I was a very little girl. When I was 5, 6 years old, he used to take me there and sit me on a fire plug, and we'd wait until someone walked a dog by the location, because Dad told me the dogs would always react crazy, and they did. They always did. This was the place where on Valentine's Day 1929, people who worked, some of the guys that worked for Al Capone, who had been staking the place out for several weeks, They came in about 10 o'clock in the morning and they gunned down 7 of the rival gangs, Bugs Moran's gangs, guys, against the rear north wall. And this location is the most notorious location in, gangland history to this day in the world. And that event made Al Capone what he still is today, the most notorious gangster in history. Because up until that time, he and Bugs Moran were kind of like neck and neck, kind of like vying for turf in the beer wars, trying to get, control of more bars and liquor making companies during that time of Prohibition. But everybody was so terrified of Capone after that day. But to this day, we did the Chicago Hauntings ghost tours for 20 years, and every night we would go past that site and we'd take everybody off the bus there. And so often people, that site, like I said, today it's a very desirable neighborhood. But back then it was rooming houses, gambling dens, it was just a really rough place.
Yeah.
But today, the site where there was a little garage there where the men were shot, and that's gone now. During the time when the first Mayor Daley had his tenure in Chicago back in the 70s, he went through Chicago and he tore down everything that had to do with the gangland era. So anywhere where any gangsters had worked or done anything, he believed that if he could get rid of the vestiges of that he could kind of wipe it from the memory, like from history, right? That people would forget about it, which didn't work, obviously. But so he tore down that little garage where it had happened. So and he had the city buy a half block there and build a senior citizen residence high rise there. So the site where the garage was is now a parking lot for that building. And oh my gosh, every night when we would go there, we would have people the senior citizens come out of this building and tell us, this place is very haunted. We see lights, we see figures moving around, we hear machine gun fire. And on the other side of that lot is high-end condos that have been made out of the rooming house that was there. In fact, famously, the woman that ran that rooming house discovered the bodies because she heard the dog barking that was chained up there, and she came next door. That building is now high-end condos, and those residents would come out and tell us that they would see, after a fresh snow in the wintertime, they would see the imprints that look like the bodies the snow where the bodies had fallen.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So we're almost to the end of the show. We're definitely going to get you back on because Chicago hauntings can go on forever.
Forever and ever and ever.
And you know so much. So much. So we definitely have to get you on for a part 2 of this podcast.
Oh, thank you.
I know you just launched, or last year you launched World of Supernatural.
Yes.
And you have like this picture shows, you have Pray for the Ghost blog, and then you have a This Presents the Darkness podcast. Where can people see this, hear this?
Everything is all gathered together on my website at worldofthesupernatural.com. So there's links to the YouTube channel, the podcast, my books, my live events, my courses that I teach at Harvard College, and everything else that I'm doing. So all you have to do is go on to worldofthesupernatural.com, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get all the information about everything that's going on.
Well, we'll definitely have to have you back because this hour has flown by.
Yes.
I know, it's crazy.
For those wanting to see her, she is going to be at a Paracon in Rock Island, October 5th. Just saying, you can come out and hear these stories in person. I'm sure she'll have copies of her books with her.
And she does have a Patreon. So if you join her Patreon, you can get, I think it's like $5
Yes, and
level.
yes, and you can get
ebook.
the ebook for free if you join my Patreon for $5, and you can get the hard copy for free if you join for $15. So that's going to probably be out at the end of next week. So if you sign up by then, you'll get the free book.
Yeah, definitely we'll have to get you back on for part 2, part 3, because this is. Oh, well, what just happened?
Oh,
we have
thank
so
you
much
so much
to talk about. If you like tonight, she will be joining me and Russ on February 25th to talk more about haunted Chicago and so much more. So, yeah, we'll definitely get you on again on the show very soon, hopefully. But I will be talking to you way before then, probably this week, about other things.
Yes.
And speaking of other shows, let's give a couple shout outs to some of the other shows on the network. You got, Ask Stacy stuff, The Awakening, tapping into your subconscious and intuition with Dee Dee and Danny. And coming back on Monday night, Compass of Curiosities with Russ, and he's going to have the one and only Johnny Zaffis, the godfather of paranormal, for you. So, and don't forget, we got Sarah on Monday, Paranormally Blonde. So there's just a wealth of shows on the network. So head on over to the network and share that. Give them some love.
And a brand new show that was just added today that I saw Sarah just publicly posted is our good friends, Nate and Mike. It was posted just on the Get Haunted page, so I can say it. I love how you were shaking your head. They are joining the P3 network. I just saw that Sarah posted it publicly on the Get Haunted Facebook page. So they will be joining the P3, so watch out for that info. But yeah, every day of the week there's a show on P3, so come and join us, learn from their guests, and yeah, never ending. So thank you again, Ursula. We appreciate you.
Appreciate you guys. Love you guys.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Yes, definitely. Bye.
Bye.